Okay friends, it's time to get started on doing our front brake job. To start, we need to safely get the front wheels off the ground. After that, let's go ahead and remove our hubcap. Remove all 5 of our 21mm lug nuts and then the wheel. So now the next thing that we want to do is push in our caliper piston. That's essentially going to push into this area right there, and it can very easily be done with a small pry bar like this. I'm just going to go ahead and get in between this area. I'm going to try to pry up against the caliper itself and the rotor on the inside there, and then gently just try to pry on this. As this is happening, I'm making sure that it's flowing freely. Get that pushed in as far as I can. Let's go ahead and do this way too. And now we'll continue on to removing our 2 14mm headed bolts. That's loose. Once your caliper's off, inspect this area along here. You want to make sure that you don't see any liquid. If you do, it's probably brake fluid, and that's going to be an issue. You also just want to make sure that the piston itself is in good condition, and what you can see of the boot doesn't look like it's torn or worn in any way. After that, go ahead and carefully set this aside, putting no pressure on your flex hose. Let's get our pads out of here. There's that one. That looks safe. Use a 17mm socket and remove these 2 mounting bolts. Just going to leave that in there a couple threads. Fully remove the bracket and set it aside. If the rotor doesn't come off of there very easily, go ahead and take a lug nut. We'll slide it on here. At this point, if you wanted to, you can use some bolts and come in between these holes right there. Just go ahead and drive them in, and that's going to push it away from the hub that's behind it. If you don't have bolts laying around, just take a hammer, make sure this is on here, hand and eye protection. We'll give it a loving bonk. Remove that rotor, set it aside for recycling. Once you have the rotor off, the next thing you want to do is clean up the mating surface of this right here. Make sure you get along all these areas, and you of course need to make sure you get in between these areas as well. All that looks good. Continue on with your brush in between here. And then you need to pay attention to this back area here. It's very common to have a lot of accumulation in there of rust or debris. Just go ahead and get it out of there. Copper never sees. Now it's going to be time to go ahead and clean up our caliper bracket. You can't go ahead and skip this step because it's super important. Let's go ahead and grab onto these sliders right here. They should essentially slide out. You don't want to rip the boot, so go ahead and take it right off of there. Carefully pull this out, and when you remove it, you need to pay special attention and put it on the same side as when you remove it. I'll show you why in a second. Get this out of here. Okay. Now looking at the two closely, you can tell that they're different. One's a little bit longer, and you'll also notice that one of them actually has like a rubber boot on it. This is essentially a vibration dampener, and if you have them in the wrong hole, you're going to have an issue. So I'm just going to go ahead and set them down with the corresponding areas, and then we'll continue stripping down the bracket. It's very common to want to go ahead and take out your caliper slider boots right here. On this particular application, you will more than likely damage them in some way when you try to remove them. So if you don't have brand new ones, you need to just go ahead and inspect them and make sure these ones are still good to go. They need to be soft and pliable, and you need to make sure that they're not torn in any way. Once you're sure that's good, let's continue on by removing these tins. Obviously those are metal, you can recycle them. All right, once you have all 4 corners nice and clean, let's grab a nice collection bucket, and we're going to start cleaning out the ports where those caliper sliders need to go. They're going to slide right up inside this area. Like I said before, overall it's a good idea to go ahead and remove the boots, but it's kind of difficult on these without damaging them. Go ahead and start spraying some cleaner in here. Bore brush. Empty it out. Give it a nice rinse. So now at this point, while this is drying, let's go ahead and set this down just like this, let it dry out. We'll continue on by cleaning up our 2 caliper slider pins. Let's go ahead and wipe them down. Once you have it wiped off, there's a couple things you want to pay attention to. You want to make sure that it doesn't have any rot or rust or anything like that on this that could restrict this slider pin from sliding inside the bracket. If you see that, it's more than likely due to this area up along here, right where my finger is. If there's any debris in there or even rot buildup, it's going to create an issue where water can make its way inside here, and of course it's going to cause an issue with the rest of the braking. So go ahead and make sure that this is nice and clean, and then pay special attention to this groove right along here. Just turn it around. Now, once we're sure all that looks good, something else that we want to pay attention to on this particular application is this rubber boot right here. Now, this is for vibration dampening, and if you were to run your fingers along it, you're going to feel that it kind of sticks out a little bit past the pin. What you want to pay attention to is just to make sure that you can't grab onto it and slide it right off. If that's the case, it's probably swollen in some way, and it's going to cause a restriction. If this has an issue, you want to just go ahead and replace this boot right here. Typically, it's going to come as a kit, and it's going to come with these boots as well. So at that point, you just replace them all. This one still looks good. I'll go ahead and set this one aside, finish cleaning this one, and then we'll continue. Okay, so now at this point, we're going to continue on to taking these caliper slider pins, and we're just going to add some lubricant to these. It's very important to add lubricant because if you don't, it's going to, of course, get seized up in there, especially with heat and everything else. So I'll just go ahead and coat this entire shaft along the boot as well. And then what we want to pay special attention to, once again, is up along this ridge right here. You want to make sure you get plenty of grease up inside there. The reason for that is because it's going to help keep moisture out. And of course, if there's no moisture in the area, you'll have less chances of this seizing up inside your caliper. We're going to go ahead and slide it back into the corresponding side here. It should slide in fairly easily. Once it slides in, make sure that the boot's sitting into the groove where it needs to be. And then just give it a nice little spin. I'm just going to go ahead and work it in and out a little bit. That feels great. Do the same to the other pin. Okay. So now let's continue on with that caliper lube, and we're just going to go ahead and put some grease along these areas here. You want to make sure that you use heat-resistant grease because you don't want it to liquefy while you're driving because, of course, your brakes are going to get hot. When you're doing this, you also want to make sure that you don't puddle it up too much because we don't want it to squeeze out and get on the brakes or the rotors. Just a little bit. That's going to help with vibration dampening, noise reduction, and keep moisture away from the area. Now, once you have that lubricated, we're going to continue on with our tins. You're going to notice that you have a whole bunch of tins in there, and essentially 4 of them are going to look the same, and then the other 4 are going to look different. That's, of course, for both sides. I just have one set out, and you can tell exactly what I'm talking about. You have these little pitons that kind of shoot off to one side or the other. Now, for these, when you're putting them on there, you want to make sure that you have those little pitons that I mentioned a second ago aiming out and away from the rotor, not facing in, because, of course, it's going to hit up against the rotor, and then it's going to make noise, and it's probably not even going to fit. Let's go ahead and slide it right in there. Sometimes these can be difficult. There we are. Give it a little wiggle, make sure it's secure. Do the same to the rest. All right, now we can set that aside. We're going to go ahead and grab onto our new pads and our inboard pad of our old pads. The reason why we want to grab the inboard pad is because of this right here. This is called your wear indicator, and it's super important. When we do this, we want to go ahead and take our brand new wear indicator, and we're going to put it on the same exact side as the original. So let's just go ahead and pick a pad. It doesn't matter which one you pick. We'll put it on the same side, slide it right in there. And now we can take both of our pads. We'll go ahead and set these aside, and we're going to get back over to the vehicle. Back over at the vehicle, let's go ahead and clean up our brand new rotor. You're going to notice that it has a lot of this film on it. That's just for shipping. Go ahead and spray it down with some brake parts cleaner. Nice clean rag, wipe it down, and then we'll get ready to install it onto the vehicle. Slide that on. Go ahead and take one of your lug nuts. We're going to go ahead and put this right on, bottom it out. That's essentially going to hold this from moving around on us. Now for the caliper itself, I'm just going to make sure that the piston's pushed all the way in. If for some reason it looks like your boot started pushing out a little bit, just take a nice small screwdriver, something that isn't sharp and you're not going to damage it with, and just carefully come right in between the creased area here, and then just gently slide it back into position. It's just essentially kind of pushing out a little bit. It's really not a big deal. It's a lot of times just air kind of built up inside there. It's very common. Make sure there's no rust or debris inside that caliper piston there, and then we're going to continue with some caliper grease. Let's go right along this metal piston, and then along the back side of both of these ears right here. Once again, this is going to help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now we can continue on by putting on the bracket. We also want to make sure that we have our caliper bracket bolts. You want to make sure that the threads are clean and free of any debris, and then I always like to use a little bit of red thread locker. Slide this right over. We're going to start in both of these bolts. We'll snug them up, and then we're going to torque them to 79 foot-pounds. Time to install our brand new pads. Remember we installed the wear indicator on the inboard pad, so that needs to go on the inside. Then we'll just take that outboard pad and slide that in afterward. All right, we've got our pad in there. Just go ahead and give it a nice wiggle. You want to make sure that it can flow around. If it feels like it was difficult to put in or you had to use a hammer of some sort, it's very common that maybe you didn't clean up the bracket enough. Just make sure that it can move around. That way there, when you release the caliper or release the brake pedal, the caliper is going to release the pads from the rotor. Let's get this outer pad on. Let's take that caliper. We're going to slide it right down and over these pads. Might need to slide in those caliper sliders a little bit. There we are. 2 caliper bolts. Start them both in, we'll snug them up, and then we're going to torque these to 26 foot-pounds. So now before we get the wheel on, let's just check everything. We have our flex hose here. You want to make sure that it doesn't have a twist in it. That would mean that you twisted the caliper before you went ahead and put it on. That could cause a restriction. Of course, you want to make sure that you did torque all your mounting bolts. After that, let's go ahead and remove this lug nut right here and get the wheel up on there. Now we're just going to go ahead and hand start on all these lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque them to 76 foot-pounds. We've got the wheel back on the ground. Let's torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Don't forget your hubcap. Here we go. And slide that right on there. You want to line up your valve stem. Give it a couple loving bonks. Make sure it's completely secured all the way around. All right, friends, we got the brakes back together. What's left to do now? Now you're going to go ahead and do the exact same thing to the other side of the vehicle. The process is the exact same, so you don't necessarily have to watch me do it. After that, climb into your passenger compartment, go ahead and pump up that brake pedal so it's nice and firm. Get under your hood, double check your master cylinder fluid. If you need fluid, go ahead and add a little bit of .3 brake fluid just up to that maximum line. Close the hood, take it for a road test. Thanks.